By every conceivable metric, conservatism has failed spectacularly. That's not an opinion. That's not what some people think. That's not an overly exaggerated expression of my frustrations with the conservative establishment. That's an objective fact that any person who honestly examines the history of this movement can conclude. And the reason you can objectively conclude this is that conservatives always want to conserve something or other. Let's go through a few examples. Conservatives historically have fought to conserve the moral and religious people John Adams said our Constitution was made for. Ask yourself, have conservatives succeeded in conserving that moral and religious society? Absolutely not, and we all know it. Our society is dominated by moral degeneracy at every possible turn, filled with drugs and crime and the collapse of the family and transgenderism and abortion and so on. Conservatives historically have fought to conserve law and order. Ask yourself, have conservatives succeeded? Absolutely not. Our cities are currently almost unlivable hellholes of crime and drugs and filth, with sky-high murder rates and rampant crime of every other category. Conservatives, historically, have fought to conserve our nation and its culture and people, because a nation is its people. Have they succeeded in that? Absolutely not. Unprecedented floods of immigration, both legal and illegal, from Latin America and the Third World have resulted in demographic replacement on a massive scale that has killed much of America's culture and made much of our cities, like Dearborn, Michigan, unrecognizable. I could go on for hours with the list of things we've tried to conserve, but have failed to conserve. The gist of it is this. Conservatives started out trying to conserve a fundamentally Christian, fundamentally moral, fundamentally orderly society from liberals, and now we live in a fundamentally secular, morally degenerate, leftist-dominated society where liberalism has infected and infiltrated all of our institutions, from the education system, from pre-K on up to the university age, to our billionaire class, to the Fortune 500 companies, to the celebrity class, to the media, to our very churches. All of those things have been conquered by leftism and modernism. We have failed to conserve in all of these areas. And any serious political movement, after 250 years of losing every battle it's ever fought, would stop, take a breath, and honestly reflect on what went wrong and why. It would recognize that there's some deep-rooted problem we must address immediately. And that problem is far deeper than most conservatives think. That problem is conservatism itself. This is a post-mortem of the conservative movement. We're going to examine all of its fatal flaws, many of which still remain to this day, and honestly assess what we can change going forward if we intend to restore civilization. You're listening to The Conservative Rebel. Before we can understand how conservatism failed, we first need to define conservatism. And this has been a very hotly debated topic for several decades within the movement, where you have neocons, liberals, libertarians, traditionalists, all these various groups that are ideologically opposed to each other, at each other's throats, mutually excommunicating each other from the movement, fighting over what the meaning of conservatism is. And that debate has never really been objectively resolved. Until now. because the only way to objectively resolve it is to admit that conservatism doesn't really have any principles or values at all. And that's one of its weaknesses. Conservatism is just conserving society the way it is. It's defending the status quo, the current culture, and the established authorities and institutions. That's the only objective way to really define it. And that's also one of its fatal flaws. Conservatism in and of itself has no principles or morality. Conservatism is not the same thing as morality, Christianity, traditionalism, right-wing politics, nationalism, or anything like that. Conservatism, as we've already said a couple seconds ago, is just conserving society. And conserving society, conserving the culture you live in, is morally neutral in a vacuum. It all depends on context. Sometimes conserving society is good, and sometimes conserving society is bad. Conservatism is a means, it's not an end. It's not the goal. It's only good, conserving society is only good, if you're conserving a good society. And while no society is perfect, some are basically good and some are basically bad. And that means that if your principle is indiscriminate conservatism of society, then you will be led down the road of nihilism and moral relativism in addition to the road of cowardice. Because conservatism is sometimes not only bad, but evil. Just look at pagan Rome. Before Constantine's conversion, the established order of pagan Rome was based on, of course, paganism. It was based on violence. It was based on corruption. It was based on tyranny. And conservatism meant defending that order from the Christians, who had these radical new moral ideas that threatened the established order and threatened the power of the elites and threatened the status of the pagan religion in that empire. So the conservatives in the 1st century, in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, they were Nero and Diocletian. Conservatism meant mass slaughtering as many Christian men, women, and children as you could lay your hands on in the most brutal imaginable ways in an attempt to completely snuff out the infant church and stop it from ever gaining any power. That's what conserving society meant in Rome. In Aztec Mexico, conservative society meant fighting against Hernando Cortés and the conquistadors to preserve a demonic order based on a religion of child sacrifice, where tens of thousands of innocent people were massacred by priests who sacrificed them to the sun god by cutting out their still beating hearts and kicking them down the steps of their pyramids. So conservatism is sometimes evil. If you're conserving an evil society, a degenerate society, an unchristian society, then that is an evil act. You should not be conserving that. And the other point to realize is that the same moral and philosophical principles that will make you conservative in one age will make you liberal in the sense of rebelling against society in another. Let's go back to the Christians in Rome. They were the liberals in Rome. They were the ones who were rebelling against the society, not violently, but with their new moral ideas and their new religion. Then once Constantine converted and Europe became based fundamentally on Christianity and governed by the church, those same Christians, their descendants, the people who followed the same religion, they became the conservatives. Christianity immediately switched from this rebellious, anti-status quo thing to the status quo. It went from opposing the order and opposing the establishment to becoming the order, to becoming the establishment. It became the dominant religion. It became the basis of society. It's the same religion, but in one age it was conservative and in one age it was liberal. And it works the same way for any belief you might have. Sometimes that belief will go against the established order, and sometimes that belief will support the established order. And our secular, leftist, modern society is yet another example of that. This is incredibly important to realize. If you only have one takeaway from this episode, if you stop listening right here, if there's one thing that's left in your mind from listening to this, let it be this. In 2025, conservatives are liberals and liberals are conservatives. Because liberalism has completely conquered and infiltrated our society, because all of our elites, all of our institutions, all of our authorities are now liberal instead of conservative, because our culture is fundamentally liberal, liberalism is the established order. Liberalism is society, which means conserving society is conserving liberalism, which means conservatism is leftism. Conservatism in 2025, if you're defining it as conserving society, is conserving leftism. So in 2025, to be a liberal, to be a rebel, to be a radical, to be a revolutionary, is to be a conservative and a traditionalist. In 1960, it was liberal, it was edgy, it was radical, it was a middle finger to the elite to be a weed-smoking, peace, love, and rock and roll hippie off the coast of Southern California. In 2025, the middle finger to the establishment, the way to rebel, is to be a moral conservative, a Christian, a traditionalist. The tables have completely turned. This is the single most important political development that has happened in a very long time, is the reversal of this situation, where liberals have become conservatives and conservatives have become liberals, where the mainstream culture of the old age has become the counterculture of the new, and the counterculture of the 1960s has become the mainstream culture of 2025. What this means is that conservatism is no longer moral. Conservatism is no longer Christian. Conservatism is immoral. Conservatism is conserving leftism. And the right needs to reject conserving society. It needs to stop defending the status quo. It needs to embrace countercultural resistance, or it will be duped into defending an order rigged against it. In 1950, there was good things left in society to conserve. In 2025, there isn't. Conservatism had its time. It had its time when it was right. It had its time when we had a duty to try to conserve society, because, though flawed, it was fundamentally good. In today's world, we have a duty to rebel against society. And we need to embrace that. But after all of these centuries of fighting and losing to the left, after all of these centuries of trying to conserve a civilization that no longer exists from liberals who were hell-bent on killing it, we have allowed conservatism to become the right's very identity. We define ourselves as conservatives. When people ask us what our political views are, we say we're conservatives. But as we have shown, that term is meaningless, and in fact, it is evil to conserve society in the literal sense in 2025. So we need to get this idea of conserving out of our minds, because it's bad. What we want to conserve is dead. And that is the most important realization that every single person who is not a leftist, who is not a communist in this country, needs to come to. The second fatal flaw of conservatism is that it always loses. And people have noticed this. People always complain that conservatives never win, they never deliver, they never get anything done. And that is, of course, partially due to the fact that our conservative leaders are inept, incompetent cowards. It's due to the fact that the GOP establishment is hopelessly corrupt. But it's also built in to the very nature of conservatism itself. And that's a very critical realization to come to. Those who want to conserve things are at an inherent disadvantage. And here's why. There are two primary political instincts that govern society. There are two instincts that really shape civilization. And those two instincts are the instinct to conserve and the instinct to rebel. The instinct to conserve is, of course, it leads you to conservatism. It's the instinct to keep society the way it is, to avoid risks, to avoid radical changes, innovations, and revolutions, to obey and submit to the established authorities and institutions. The instinct to rebel is, just like it sounds, the instinct to rebel against society, the instinct to change society, to question authority, to question institutions. And the instinct to conserve has always dominated among the old. Its poster boy has always been the creaky-jointed old curmudgeon sitting on his rocking chair, yelling to the sky about the deviant ways of the wayward youth, and yearning for the good old days when creaky-jointed curmudgeons in armchairs yelled at him. Now, granted, it's true that previous generations of curmudgeons were less prone to use the specific words transphobe, homophobe, and heteronormative patriarchal Christofascist when ranting about the wayward ways of the youth. That was actually less common in previous generations than it is in our current one, but the fundamental instinct behind it was still the same. It's the instinct to preserve the society that you know, the society that you grew up in, the society that you built your career in. And today that society frowns on heteronormative patriarchal Christofascism, or whatever that means. So that's what the old people are yelling at. That's why there's all the old people at the No Kings protests, famously. And the instinct to rebel, of course, has always dominated among young people, especially among young men. That's been observed by everyone for pretty much all of human history. Young men are the rebels. They are behind all of the revolutions. They are behind all of the great changes, all of the great reforms and degenerations of liberalism that have happened throughout human history. They're also the ones who are the most active, the most energetic, both physically and mentally. They're the ones who are just getting started out in the world, while the old people are the ones who are just exiting the world and entering retirement. Therefore, the young people are prone to wield a lot more influence than the old people are in society. So the instinct to rebel is stronger, more ruthless, and more powerful and more effective than the instinct to conserve is, and that's built into the very nature of things. Eternal truths like nothing lasts forever, the law of change, the law of entropy itself, that disorder always increases, they lend support to the instinct to rebel. Change does not need energetic, revolutionary young people to succeed at eating away at society steadily and surely. But with that base of young people, revolutionary young people, it does it a lot faster. The mellow, temperate conservatism of old age, the cautious conservatism that comes when you're old, has never been a match for the bold, ruthless rebellion of the youth, whether that rebellion is harnessed for bad ends or for good ends. And this creates a generational cycle, a vicious cycle that ensures that society is in a state of constant flux, where the young rebels, they go to college, they enter the world, they enter their careers, they succeed in implementing whatever radical change to the status quo of their parents that they wanted to implement. But then they buy houses, then they have families, then they get settled down. And then they want to protect the status quo. But the catch is, they don't want to protect the status quo that their parents had. They want to protect the status quo they created. That means they want to protect the status quo of their parents after the radical changes they fought for were enacted. So they're now defending a status quo that their parents would have seen as raging liberal, even though that's what conservatism now means. And then those people have kids, those defenders of the more liberal status quo have kids, and their kids grow up, they go to college, they enter into the world, and now they want to change the liberal status quo of their parents and make it even more liberal. And then by the time they have kids and they start to mellow out and become conservative temperamentally, they're defending the even more hyper-radical status quo they created. So in this generational cycle, society continuously changes, it continuously gets more liberal, and the conservatives, instead of conserving the old ways, instead of conserving antiquity, instead of conserving the civilization that the first generation of conservatives fought for, they're forced to keep fighting for yesterday's revolution. So you don't really have true conservatives because of this generational cycle. You just have the revolutionaries of yesterday versus the revolutionaries of today. Ultra, hyper, extreme radical liberals versus slightly less radical but still extreme liberals. The game is fundamentally rigged because of this generational psychology against anyone who wants to conserve anything for any length of time. Because as soon as one generation of revolutionaries mellows out with age, as soon as they're itched to revolt against society, their hunger for transformation and degeneration is finally satiated. As soon as they stop causing trouble and stirring up the hornet's nest, the next generation of revolutionaries, inevitably even more radical than they are, is catapulted onto the stage, and society continually degenerates and changes. And on top of the law of change and this generational vicious cycle dooming conservatism to eternal defeat, there's the fact that conservatives can only ever play defense. That's the only thing they can ever do. Because they're fundamentally uncomfortable with aggressive change, with innovation, with radical new tactics, or anything like that. They never take the initiative. They never go after their enemies. They never have bold proposals to defeat their enemies and foil the plots of the liberals. So conservatives are stuck playing a never-ending game of whack-a-mole that's impossible to win. They're constantly trying to smack down the moles shooting up out of the ground, constantly trying to smack down the latest threat, but they're never fast enough to get all of them, and inevitably they suffer defeat after defeat after defeat until they catch their breath and realize that the game was rigged against them from the beginning, and that everything they fought for is dead. Everything they fought to conserve is dead. So conservatism always loses by its very nature. That is a built-in feature, not a bug. It always loses. And when your movement's core principle is conservatism, when your movement's identity is conservatism, your movement's core principle and your movement's identity is losing. It is fundamentally uncomfortable with wielding power. It is fundamentally uncomfortable with winning, and for that reason, it is content to constantly play defense, to never do anything effective ever, and will inevitably never succeed and be completely destroyed. That is the fate of conservatism. That's why we've lost, okay? If you're wondering, here are some of the reasons why we've lost. It was inevitable from the beginning that we would lose. Sure, we've been cowards. Sure, we've been corrupt, overly moderate people, but we were always gonna lose. You're always losing when you're stuck playing this game. But here's the good news. Because of this situation that we've described, because leftism is now the status quo, and because leftists now dominate society, the tables have turned completely. Because the conservatives are the rebels, the liberals, and because the liberals are the conservatives, now that generational cycle is going to work to our advantage if we play this right. Now, we're going to be getting generations of people, if we have the correct strategy, if we have the correct mindset of this, who are becoming more and more conservative. Now we can force the left to play that game of whack-a-mole that's rigged against them. And who knows, in a couple hundred years, maybe we will have succeeded in doing what liberalism has done in a couple hundred years. Maybe after a couple generations of this, we will have restored Christendom. We will have restored Western civilization. Because that's what's happened. That's just a reality, and everyone's noticing it. Young men, Gen Z more broadly, but young men in particular, are more conservative than ever before. That's a statistical reality. They voted for Trump in 2024. Voting for a Republican was once unthinkable for the youngest generation, but now it's what's happening. They're more socially conservative. They're embracing tradition. They're embracing Christianity, especially traditional forms of it, like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. They're socially conservative Christian traditionalists. It's crazy, but that's what young men are now. That's what's happening. And the reason for that is because of this generational psychology. It's because they're driven by the same instinct to rebel that's behind the hippie movement. Except because leftism dominates society, this is how they rebel. They rebel by becoming right-wing Christians. And what's more, they are more right-wing, more Christian, more traditionalist than their parents and their grandparents were, because the generational psychology also plays out within the conservative movement itself. Because now these old conservatives, these boomer conservatives, these Bush-Romney neocons, these liberals from 1964, JFK, MLK liberals, these people, to rebel against them, they're becoming more radical conservatives, so they're hopping back generations. The cycle has now completely reversed itself. Now, if the old conservatives, if the Republican establishment is conservatives from the 1980s, if they're Reaganites, they're saying, okay, I'm going to become an America First conservative from the 1930s or 40s. Or, okay, I'm going to become a conservative from the 1900s or the 1860s, or okay, I'm going to become a conservative by 1776 standards. I'm going George Washington, or I'm going to become a conservative by Enlightenment liberalism standards. I'm going to reject this whole democratic liberal ideology and embrace tradition, or to hell with it, I'm going to become a conservative by the Middle Ages standards, which is why they're going to all these traditionalist forms of Christianity. So we now have an unprecedented opportunity, absolutely unprecedented, people on the right, as we know it, because the right really came into existence in response to Enlightenment liberalism, for once, we can play this game, and it's not going to be rigged against us. For once, we can force the left to play this game of whack-a-mole. For once, we actually have a fair shot of winning. The key is not to alienate these young men, which is precisely what you see the Republican establishment doing. If they question America's foreign policy, they're called anti-Semitic. If they question America's immigration policy, they're called xenophobic. If they question liberal assumptions, they're called anti-Americans who reject the ideology of the Founding Fathers, and so on. Because now the conservatives are attacking these people from the left of them. These people are to the right. Young people are to the right of the old people. So the key is not to alienate them. Because our victory, even though it's now possible because of this generational shift, this fundamental generational shift that has civilization-saving ramifications, potentially, but our victory is not inevitable. It's possible to throw it away if you're stupid enough. And a lot of people are stupid enough, which is why they call all these young people who are more conservative than them woke right, racists, and all the other stupid labels that the left called even moderate conservatives at the height of wokeness. So we really need to play this carefully, but if we play this right, we can win. And the way we play this right is by a fundamental change in strategy, in messaging, and in goals. The change is this. We need to stop messaging as conservatives. We need to stop saying, oh, we're defending the status quo. We're defending America as it is. We want to conserve things because if you're a serious person, you don't. If you're a serious person, you know that we're in hell right now. Our society is stupid. It's insane. People can't afford houses. Our cities are overwhelmed with drugs and illegal immigrants. You know that. So the solution, the way to further get more young men to join the conservative movement, quote unquote, which we really should not be calling ourselves that anymore, is to shift. It's to embrace countercultural revolution and resistance. We need to reject conservatism and embrace reform, revolution, and transformation. And if we do that, we actually finally have a fighting chance. And all of these forces, all of these generational cycles, all of this finally starts to play to our advantage, and we can use this as leverage against the left. After centuries of civilizational struggle, after centuries of losing every battle we fight, after centuries of devastating total defeats, we finally can take the fight to the left.